This is Point of Inquiry for Monday, November 11th, 2013.
And welcome to this very special live issue of Point of Inquiry. I'm here with the distinguished journalist, Katherine Stewart, and as Joe Nickel would say, she has a book. And it is called The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. And my first question for you is, so who are these people? Who's behind this? Who are the Christian Right?
Who are the Christian Right? The book is about good news clubs, and there are these clubs in public elementary schools that are sponsored by an organization called the Child Evangelism Fellowship. It's an organization that represents a fundamentalist form of evangelical Christianity, I actually thought about, for the subtitle, instead of saying the Christian Right, saying the fundamentalist assault on public education. I'm sorry, the fundamentalist assault on America's children. But I think there was the feeling at the publishing house that people wouldn't understand what kind of fundamentalism we were talking about here. The term Christian Right is problematic in my view. There are many people who are Christian in America and who also happen to fall on the right sort of, consider themselves right-wing politically, who are not a part of this movement. The movement that I write about in my book is really about a group that is fundamentalist, and they also represent a kind of Christian nationalism, a vision of America as a so-called Christian nation as defined by them. So they, to a large extent, are the sector that is behind a lot of the religious initiatives in public schools today. Now, there are some other religions that are represented among the groups that are trying to infiltrate public education. In Chapter 9 of my book, I believe it's Chapter 9 of my book, I read about a program that was sponsored by the Kabbalah Center religion, which was they'd placed a sort of character education program in one of the public elementary schools that my daughter attended. But to a very large extent, it is these very conservative evangelical groups that are sort of inserting their programs in the public schools.
I think it's very interesting. You write in the book that the religious right likes to claim, and many liberals also believe, that they are reclaiming religiosity in the public school system, that according to their vision of the world, the American public school system was very religious until the early 60s when the Supreme Court wrenched all that away. What's wrong with that picture?
Well, there's a lot that's wrong with that picture. Certainly when schools began, in the colonial days, each community, was tended to be fairly religiously homogenous. As you all know, there are a lot of different Christian denominations, a lot of different Protestant denominations in America, but communities tended to be fairly uniform. So as long as those communities and their churches within them were running the schools, their form of the Christian religion could be taught without much controversy. But as soon as there was a sort of common school movement, what form of the Protestant religion became an area of much controversy in the early 19th century when the common school movement started gaining force. The Congregationalists in Massachusetts quickly seized control of the public schools, and Unitarians and Baptists were upset about this. There were other Protestant denominations that had established communities in America. There were Catholics, there were Episcopalians, German Reformed, Lutheran. And so what form of religion was going to be taught in the schools became a subject of much debate and much controversy. And Horace Mann, who founded the public schools, he actually made a decision that the schools should be what he called non-sectarian, which is to say that he thought they should teach common Protestant values, which he as a Unitarian thought would not be divisive at all. So it was a kind of very non-sectarian within it was like pansectarianism within the Protestant faith rather than genuinely non-sectarian. And this proved workable for a number of decades until Catholics started to immigrate to America in large numbers. And at that point, there was just enormous conflict over religion in public schools. People fought and died in the streets over whether the Catholic version of the Bible could be read in Philadelphia. There was a move
So the early school reformers anticipated that sectarian conflict could bring down the entire project of public education.
Exactly. You know, I grew up in Boston, and in Boston, Catholic children were forbidden to read from their version of the Bible, and in their churches, they were told, you must not read from the Protestant Bible. And there was a little boy named Thomas Wall who refused to read from the Protestant Bible, the King James Version, when his teacher instructed him to. And he was beaten for 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And the next day, 400 boys at his school, the Eliot School, walked out in protest. This is called the Eliot School Rebellion. And based on this incident, as one of the incidents that prompted the formation of the parochial school system, Catholic parochial school system, at that time, it's really important to note, when Catholics started to immigrate to America, public school textbooks were filled with racist characterizations of Catholics and sort of vile descriptions of the Pope and Catholicism. So it became very contentious. And I think what we can learn from our history is that when public schools in a diverse area promote one form of religion, the results are really detrimental, not only to community cohesion, but to education itself.
And you saw that in your own reporting in terms of the social fabric when these evangelical programs would come in and you'd start seeing bullying and sectarian conflict in the present day.
It's interesting. Not far from here is a community right outside of Seattle called Loyal Heights. It's a religiously diverse community. In chapter 1 of my book, I describe what happened to this very harmonious community when a Good News Club came to the public elementary school there. And one of the dads said this very sad thing to me. He said, before we were all Loyal Heights parents together, all coming together in support of our kids. And now you walk into the playground and you're a Christian. You're the wrong kind of Christian. You're a Jew. You're a Buddhist. You're an atheist. The injection of a particular, form of religion in the public schools divides people and makes people start to look at each other as other rather than as parents together in this common project of supporting our children and their future.
You spoke so well today about the Good News Clubs, and that video would be available on YouTube. So I wanted to focus on a different major theme from your book, and that's abstinence-only sex education. And you make a really interesting point about abstinence-only sex education, that the Christian right went from trying to ban or suppress sex ed in schools to hijacking it as their own form of evangelism. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, since actually, hundreds of millions, if not over $1 billion, has gone to support these abstinence until marriage sex education programs that deliver a religiously driven overlay of values and judgments and sort of advance this idea that there's only really one way to have an intimate life. and that they portrayed this idea that any kind of sex outside the marital bed is dangerous and harmful and shameful, particularly for women. But I understand you've had your own experience exploring some of these programs. I want to hear about that.
Abstinence-only education has kind of fallen out of the national media since Obama cut the funding to it, and I hadn't really given it much thought since the Bush administration, where you get these headlines about $200 million in 2006 going to support abstinence-only education, and I hadn't really thought about it very much. But then I was on assignment for 2 weeks in the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas, about 8 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, and I was working on a reproductive rights story that I can't talk too much about right now because it's in press, or it's still in the reporting stages. But it involved interviewing a lot of sex educators and a lot of teen parents. And there are a lot of teen parents in the lower Rio Grande Valley. 2 out of every 5 Latina girls will become mothers or get pregnant before they're 20 years old. And I started talking to some of these girls. We went out for pizza with a bunch of friends of my journalism student, translator, fixer, and we were just talking about their lives. One girl's 19 years old, and she had 3 kids. And they were all graduates of either abstinence only or abstinence plus public education in the Texas school system. And it just shocked me. I was utterly shocked. And I was shocked when I talked to sex educators in Planned Parenthood and community activists who were saying, we always bring parents to the puberty education classes. And one of the things we noticed was that we were getting as much feedback from the parents as from the kids, saying, nobody's ever taught me accurate sex education before. And it just really opened my eyes. And so I wanted to ask you, can you expand on the difference between what we call comprehensive sex ed or medically accurate sex ed and abstinence only?
Well, abstinence-only sex ed posits the idea that the only way to have responsible sexual activity is if you're in the context of a marriage, and doesn't teach really about birth control or the avoidance of STDs, the sort of protected sex. Did you find that was what was being taught in your program? In the
they were graduates mostly of I think it's called Making the Best Choice or Choosing for the Better or something something like that. And it's a program that's taught in a lot of schools in Texas and elsewhere. It's a beneficiary of federal funding. And I noticed that it seemed to be perpetuating a lot of very sexist stereotypes. I mean, I didn't see the kids repeating those back to me particularly, but when I got curious about the program and started looking it up online, I noticed that it was recycling a lot of really retrograde ideas about
for
gender.
Example, I want to hear what you found in the textbooks you looked at.
I was really shocked because they had these interviews with these wholesome-looking teens, and the message about choosing for the best was from boys was, well, they're the girls you date and the girls you marry. And the reason that you should abstain from sex until marriage wasn't, they sort of paid lip service to it so you won't get pregnant, so you won't get sex diseases. That was the term that they used. But really the reason that you were supposed to abstain from sex until marriage was because, especially if you were a girl, it would make you a dirty, damaged, sick person that nobody would want to, or nobody would love and nobody would respect, that you would be. It was this sort of essentialist narrative in terms of the curriculum, and I was just really shocked that this was being taught in public schools.
So there is this message of sexual disgust that's conveyed in a lot of the classroom activities.
Can you tell everyone about the cheesy cup story?
Oh, I'll find it. I actually wrote about a number of these abstinence.
I warn you guys, this is
programs.
really gross.
Oh, do I have to read it? Will you read it?
I'll read it.
Okay, thank you.
You find the page, I will read it. This is an exercise paid for by U.S. taxpayer dollars. This is supposed to teach kids something important about love and life and relationships and purity, and it involves essentially backwashing cheese doodles.
Backwashing cheese doodles. Okay, I'm going to find it. This Barry Lynn, actually, in his book, reported this particular exercise right here.
Yeah. Boys and girls are invited to chew cheese-flavored snacks and then sip some water, after which they are to spit the resulting bodily fluids into a cup. After a game in which the fluids are combined with those of other students, ultimately all the cups are poured into into a pitcher labeled multiple partners, sitting adjacent to a pitcher of water labeled pure fluids. Anybody getting Dr. Strangelove references here? In the final segment, each boy and girl is asked to fill a cup labeled either future husband or future wife with the contents from one or the other of the pitchers.
So it's amazing because these programs, they actually de-educate. Representative Harry Waxman did a study of abstinence-only sex education programs and found that 80% of the data that was reported in these programs was either flat out false or misleading.
What are some of your favorite examples of factually misleading or pseudoscientific claims in these abstinence-only curricula?
Well, I did see some curricula that spread the myth that AIDS can be spread through, saliva, things like that. But, more important than any factual, some of them are more factually accurate than others. Some of them really just kind of deliver a judgmental overlay about the right way to have sex, which is always in the context of a heterosexual marriage. But more than that, I think what they really are accurate at doing is giving kids the idea that there is a, quote, right group in society, one with all the answers, and one that has the sort of endorsement of the public school, and a wrong group, which is everyone else.
I think my favorite example of pseudoscience in the abstinence-only curriculum from your book was a program called Wonderful Days, which endorsed the rhythm method. You can't make this stuff up. Can you give us a sense of the scale of abstinence-only education? I know you said $1 billion has been poured into it. How many kids are getting abstinence-only messaging every day in our public schools?
Well, it's declined significantly under the Obama administration. He's cut off funding for it, although there was a $50 million rider attached to the Affordable Health Care Act at one point. I'm not sure whether that's still attached to it, but at one point a rider, setting aside $50 million was attached to that Affordable Care Act.
And this turned out to be a real cash cow for some pretty marginal groups.
It's interesting because once the money, it's sort of abstinence until marriage programs does represent a significant percentage of the money that has flowed into sort of from secular, organizations into faith-based organizations. And once the money comes in, it's very difficult to track where it actually goes.
I noticed that when I was doing reporting during the Bush administration, looking at the 990s of some of these organizations, their tax forms that they have to file as nonprofits, you'd see $100,000 go in, and you just see, $80,000 of it accounted as other spending.
Were you focusing exclusively on abstinence programs, or were you focusing on other kinds of nonprofits?
Well, it was abstinence, and then there was sort of a constellation because there were the maternity group homes that went along with that,
right,
and various other kinds of Christian organizations that they weren't very scrupulous about, delineating exactly which function was what and what was religious and what was secular, and they didn't really have to, which I find ironic because Planned Parenthood and other reproductive choice organizations that have anything to do with abortion have to be scrupulously careful that nothing in the family planning arm of their operations is organizationally attached in any way to any part of the abortion arm of Planned Parenthood's activities. It's a real double standard.
It's really interesting. I write, in my book about, a wide range of religious initiatives in public schools, and I hear from people all across the country about new initiatives that I didn't know about before. And I've heard a gentleman in Florida who ran a tutoring business whose sole purpose was really to tutor kids who need extra help. He told me that he was being priced out and underbid by these faith-based groups that have gotten into the tutoring business, and their real purpose is not to teach kids. It's really to evangelize. That all takes place after school. But he says he can't compete because he has to pay. He has different tax requirements, different kinds of reporting requirements, and some of the faith-based groups that are getting in are getting favorable treatment because they offer sort of a better
Are they getting
financial...
tax dollars to create these curricula so they can undercut
this is just one story that I heard, so I'm not really, I don't want to assert anything about what they're getting, but it's remarkable that the expansion of faith-based initiatives is diverting a lot of money from kind of secular nonprofits and organizations into faith-based. And then it's very hard, of course, to figure out where the money goes.
I think that's one of the great underreported investigative stories is, exactly where all this faith-based money went, because it seemed to sort of disappear into this morass. You couldn't really tell what was going on the tax forms.
It's interesting that abstinence-only education isn't the only kind of religious initiative in the school that comes in purporting to teach kids about these valuable topics like, health and other religious groups that, come into the schools to teach about anti-bullying programs or drunk driving programs or, don't do drugs and health, self-esteem and that kind of stuff. And, the power team, the strength team, there are all these different groups with these sort of fabulous secular sounding names that come into the schools with these programs like Muscle Man shows and magic shows sometimes even rock bands. And the idea is to teach kids about how to live in a responsible, healthy way. But once they get into the schools, it becomes really clear that the real aim is not to teach the kids about drunk driving or, anti-bullying. The real aim is to convert kids to their form of religion.
And that can include things like Scientology as well as conventional religions.
Indeed. Right? I wrote about, in my book, one of the other religious organizations I write about is the Scientologists. They had a group called Narcanon. They were coming into the public schools to teach about drug addiction. Actually, they were running, I believe, some drug treatment centers in addition. And they kind of ran into some trouble in the LA area. They were shut down eventually. I think people were fundamentally uncomfortable with the idea that the Scientologists were coming into the schools and trying to teach their kids how to live responsible lives. But what I find is really interesting is...
You don't think Tom Cruise is a model?
When it's religious minority groups like the Scientologists or the Kabbalah Center or the Wiccans or, these other groups that are trying to...
Are there Wiccans trying to get into the public school system?
Well, I heard from a woman in West Virginia who's Wiccan, who saw religious distribution in her kids' public schools. So she said, okay, I'm going to distribute some Wiccan literature. And they sort of said, no, you can't do that. And I believe she went to Americans United and said, well, you've opened the forum, so you have to treat, my religion on a par with the other religions. But when groups generally try to do, exert their rights, these, minority religious groups try to exert their rights in the same way that the majority groups do, they tend to be shut down, if not by law, then by convention. I want to give you a couple of examples. There was a lot of Gideon's Bible distribution in Miami, Oklahoma, and a Muslim family said, okay, well, our kids came home with Bibles, so we're going to distribute Qurans in the school. Well, you can imagine how that went down. Another example.
Did they get so much hate mail their server crashed? Was that the group?
No, but they did get hate mail, and it made them fear for their lives.
Which group was it that got so much hate mail from their alternative religious initiative that their servers crashed?
There was a group trying to distribute a couple of Camp Quest folks who were trying to distribute information about Camp Quest because there was all this information going home with the kids.
Which is a humanist camp, right?
A humanist camp, yes. And the Vacation Bible Camp flyers were going home, and they said, okay, we'll distribute Camp Quest flyers. And they were told no, and they said, well, actually, you have to let us do this because you've opened the forum. And they were able to do it, even though a lot of teachers sort of threw the flyers in the trash. And then with what limited distribution they were able to accomplish, the school got so much hate mail their server crashed. So,
wow, that's really stark. Another thing I noticed in the book that was really interesting was essentially there's a parasitic infection of the New York City school system every Sunday by evangelical churches. And I live across the street from a public school. I had no idea this was going on. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it's interesting. That issue is really a subject right now to it's a subject of a lot of controversy, and the case has been wending its way through the courts. It's still very much active in the courts. But I was surprised to learn when we moved from Santa Barbara to New York City, and we lived literally across the street from our kids' public school. And I was shocked one Sunday to look out of my door and see that there was a church service taking place in our kids' public school. So I actually decided to attend the church service and see what it was all about. And I was really astonished. I was in the auditorium, which was filled with kids' names and pieces of, pictures, and their kids had done their artwork. And
so they could be targeted for evangelism?
Well, no, but this is what our kids did as part of the school. They put up their artwork and they made posters of themselves and put their images and names were filling the hallways. This is just part of their projects. But people at the church were actually instructed to take notice of those names and pray on those children. And I thought, this is astonishing. I am mandated by law to send my kids to this public school where their images and names will get involved in the religious activities of a group that believes that we are going to hell. And it just was kind of astonishing to me. Another time, my little boy at that point, he was in kindergarten, and they wanted to do a musical performance. So we were all in the auditorium, and we were all facing these kids, and they were facing us. And the backdrop of the show behind us was the posters of the churches and their signage and the posters for their mission projects. And I thought, what great advertising for them. They store their posters and their signage in the auditorium where everybody can see it. Now, McDonald's isn't allowed to come into my kids' public school and leave, McDonald's banners around. So why is this church somehow allowed to involve itself in the life of our kids' public schools? I want to mention, by the way, this church did not pay a penny of rent to the Department of Education. They just paid a small fee to the custodians union that partially covered the cost of servicing the rooms after they used them. Now, they call that rent. That's not rent. That's like me squatting in an apartment building and hiring a housekeeper, but stiffing the landlord and saying, well, I'm paying rent because I paid the housekeeper. That's not rent. And this church was using our kids' public school up to 4 days a week, after hours. And other public churches that have been planted in New York City public schools have done things like candy distribution. One was found distributing hot chocolate to the kids during school hours in the schoolyard, and then inviting the children to come to the church at their school, distributing flyers and posters. So the New York City Department of Ed is actually very upset about this state of affairs, these churches that are using the public schools without paying a cent of rent, and that this issue is still being fought out in the courts.
The value of what they're getting in New York City, everything revolves around real estate, and they describe in the book some of these churches that are using 1,000-seat auditoriums in public schools.
Amazing thing is,
what they're getting.
There are tons of churches in New York City. I mean, tons and tons of churches. I went to one public school, PS3, where there was an anti-gay ministry being run out of the church that was planted in that public school. By the way, the public school's in the West Village, if you can imagine that. Part of it is on Christopher Street. I don't know if you know. So anyway, there was
not in tune with community sensibilities.
Not
in any
exactly.
Way, shape, or
so
form.
There's a church that's planted at that PS3, on Christopher Street, and one of the women said, "Oh, we used to rent space in a church, but this is just free. So this is just so much cheaper than even renting space in a church." I want to tell you something funny. I know we're running over, so I'll stop really soon. But I published an op-ed in the New York Times about this issue. You know who I heard from? I heard from church about this sort of paradoxical thing where you have these churches planted rent-free in public schools. These churches contacted me, and real estate agents for churches contacted me and said, we've got space we'd like to rent out to these churches that are occupying the schools. How can you put us in touch with them? And I was like, they don't want to be in your church. I'm sorry. They want to be in the public school because there is, A, it's free, and B, much more than that, they want to be in the public schools because of the natural association with the school community and their proximity to kids. And I think what this gets to, the overriding theme I discovered in my book, and we can end with that, is that religious fundamentalists want to be in the public schools because they want to, quote, take back the public schools and repurpose them with a fundamentalist Christian agenda. Young children cannot distinguish between an activity that takes place in their public school and one that is endorsed by their public school. They think if something happens in the school, it must have the stamp of state authority. It must be what the school wants them to believe. It must be what they should believe. As parents, we tell our children how important it is to study hard and to do well in school and to respect their teachers and respect the institution of their school. And that's why fundamentalists want to be in the schools. And that's why these Good News Clubs, nearly 4,000 of them nationwide, are so intent on getting their programs in the public schools.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's such a pleasure.